Well, here we are again, another anti-podcast, Science in Theology. I'm your host, Nemanja Jurisic, and today we have for the second time with us specialist in ancient Egypt and the Bible, Dr. David Falk, our still best guest ever on our channel. So, Dr. David Falk, how are you? And welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm doing great. Best guess ever, huh?
Yeah, sorry. I just love your work and stuff you do. So I call our audience to follow your channel, Ancient Egypt and the Bible, and to buy your book about Ark of the Covenant and also support you. So for those who don't know you, Dr. Falk has 4 degrees. One of them is a PhD in Egyptology. He's a leading scholar on the topic that I mentioned, Ark of the Covenant. His mentors and professors were Professor Kenneth Kitchen, the very architect of Egyptian chronology, times described him like that, and also great Dr. James Hoffmeyer. Just briefly, Dr. Fall, can you say something about those professors? I wonder how.
Um,
Yeah,
what exactly do you want me to say about those professors?
yeah. Can you say something about Kenneth Kitchen? He is my favorite scholar and
He's a character. um, a brilliant man. He's a brilliant man. He's a man of incredible faith. He also doesn't put up with nonsense at all. And he will often say things with that everyone's thinking in the room and nobody has the guts to say. I was sitting in a lecture where him and I were attending, and there was some lady from another um, Cambridge College speaking on the documentary hypothesis, and he gets up and he says, "I'm not convinced." We're all going, "Yeah, none of us were, but we were going to say it."
yeah, I heard something similar from Michael Hazel. He says that he presented something about archaeology and some minimalist stood up and say, "Ah, this is not enough." And he stood up and he said, "Shut up, you! Accept the evidence. Deal with that." Yeah, so he is great. Okay. Our main topic today will be historical Joseph from the Bible. So I prepared some questions for you, Dr. Falk. So let's start. Uh,
Okay.
yeah. First one is what are evidences for historical Joseph, both internal and archaeological?
Okay. Now, the first thing we kind of have to recognize is what's the time frame that we would expect Joseph to be in. Now, the best actual evidence we have for this is an internal piece of evidence from Genesis 41:43 and 46:29, which is the presence of chariots. Okay. The presence of the chariot begins in Egypt at the beginning of Dynasty 15, which is the dynasty of the Hyksos. So the chariot is introduced right around 1666 BC. It's a super easy number to remember. So Joseph comes to Egypt sometime after that. So that's sort of our terminus to the earliest possible date for Joseph. Okay, so that sticks Joseph somewhere in the second intermediate period. The problem with the second intermediate period is it's sort of an Egyptian dark age. We have very few texts from that period of time. In fact, the compilation of the texts from all dynasties in the second intermediate period amounts to about 25 pages of text. We have almost no records from that period of time. So we don't know who the viziers were. And that goes for dynasties 15, 16, and 17 and 14. We don't know who the leading officials are. These are just this is an area, a point in time where we just don't have the records. So, with that said, what we have to do is then resort to what's called indirect evidence, which is evidence of plausibility. Is the Joseph narrative plausible given the internal evidence that is presented by the Bible? Because that's the only record we really have for Joseph or for anybody in that period. if we're really blunt about this. I mean, even our knowledge of the succession of kings is sketchy for that period. Really sketchy. So we don't even have full biographies for all the kings. In fact, we have full biographies for almost none of them. So, when you're missing the records of the kings themselves, you don't have a lot to go on. So then, given the Joseph narrative, is that something that would be consistent with Second Intermediate Period Egypt? And if so, is his narrative plausible? Now, fortunately, the Bible does give us some clues to this end. During his investiture as vizier, there are three things in Genesis 41, I think it's 42, that he's given that would be very indicative of an investiture of a vizier. He's given a chain of gold. Now, a chain of gold is not just given to viziers, it's given to other scribes and administrators too, but it's the Egyptian equivalent to the Congressional Medal of Honor. It's a high honor. You have to do something actually important to get it. And we have statues of scribes and viziers and administrators that have earned the chain of gold. And it's a big, big deal. You see it on all their statues. They wear it, proudly because it is that kind of honor. As I said, it's the Egyptian equivalent of, say, the President's Medal or the Congressional Medal of Honor, like the top honor of the nation. The second thing he's given is a set of clothes. Now, this is often overlooked, but this is really important because the clothing for a vizier, you can't get off a rack. It's specially made for the vizier. And you can see an example of this in Theban Tomb 100, the tomb of Rekhmire. And it's very dissimilar. It's not like any other Egyptian clothing. It's kind of like it almost looks like a dress that's cinched under the armpits. So it's cinched under the armpits, and it's just a robe that just flows to the floor. And it's very unique to viziers. So it's something that has to be specially commissioned. You can't get this basically done at any other clothier. The king has to commission this. So the king has to give you those clothing. The third thing he's given is the royal seal. And this is often associated with the title to seal bearer of the king. And basically, he's the guy that holds the stamp that puts the official signature on documents. And kings had a variety of people at times be the seal bearer. Sometimes it was a vizier, sometimes it wasn't. But the fact here that Joseph is vizier and seal bearer and receives essentially the Congressional Medal of Honor for Egypt is a very telling thing of his accomplishments. And those are accomplishments that are very Egyptian in nature. The other thing, too, is when he is made vizier over the land as an Asiatic. He's the first sort of Asiatic that becomes vizier, but he's not the only one. There's two other instances of Asiatics that also become vizier. Apparel is one, and Setnok is another one. These are Asiatics that were from Syria or the Levant who also serve at some point as vizier. So the idea that Joseph couldn't have been vizier because he was, an Asiatic is not borne out by, say, the culture. So the culture is does readily accept, say, foreigners in that position of being vizier. The 20 shekels of silver in Genesis 37, 28 is consistent with the price of slaves at the time of the Second Intermediate Period. So that's the sort of price we would expect for a slave at the time. So that's consistent. The dream interpretation. Now, this one's really interesting because there's two dreams that he interprets when he's in the prison. The first one is the say the squeezing the wine, the grapes into a wine. Now we find this dream and its interpretation in Papyrus Chester Beatty 3. It's there. It's not a good sign. It's a very bad sign. Basically, in Chester Beatty 3, it says if you get this dream, you're finished. You're done for. You can cash in your chips. There's no hope for you. So, when the wine taster gets that dream, I mean, he's really worried. He's really worried. He's asking Joseph here for a second opinion. And Joseph said, don't worry. It's a good dream in your case. And it turns out to be true. And this is amazing. This amazes him because it's not the standard interpretation. But because it's not the standard interpretation, we know what the standard interpretation is in the culture. And then to find that standard interpretation confirmed by Chester Beatty 3 is really remarkable. But that's the way sort of dream interpretation worked. It was codified. You couldn't just be given a dream and just interpret it on the fly. You had to look it up in the book. The book was the oracle of the dreams. The book told you what the dreams meant. And if it wasn't in the book, you couldn't interpret it. And the Egyptians were really rigid about this. They were really rigid about this. So it's not like you would go to a psychic and say, hey, I got this dream, and she would make something up. It's not like that at all. They had to go to a reference manual. They had to go to a reference manual. They had to look it up. They had to see if it's a good or bad dream. And it tells you in the reference manual, good dream or it's a bad dream. Nefer, good. Bin, bad. So, and that's how these dreams books were arranged. It gives you the dream and its interpretation, and then whether it's a good or a bad dream. So you could not mistake a dream interpretation in Egypt because you had to look it up in a reference work. So the fact that Joseph's dream is found in this reference book, and it is the counterintuitive, or basically the opposite of the manual, what it says, and that interpretation of Joseph's comes true, is why he sort of rises to the wine steward's attention when Pharaoh himself, the king himself, needs his dream interpreted. Because the king's got a dream that's not in the dream books. Who can interpret this? And the wine taster goes, hey, I know a guy. Knew a guy in the clink who could help you out. There's also the command to bow, which we find when he rides the chariot, in Genesis 41. When he rides the chariot with the king, and it's commanded abarak. That's an Egyptian loanword. It means to bow. Okay. So that too is consistent with the period of time. Uh, the city of Ianu, which is Heliopolis. Again, a geography that is consistent with the second intermediate period. That's no surprise. It's a long lasting city, but it is also still a detail that's important, as it was still a city of incredible prominence at that time. And finally, it's where Joseph locates his brothers when they immigrate to Egypt. He puts them in the land of Goshen. Now, we do find Goshen in the late Egyptian miscellanies in Papyrus Anastasi 4. And it's identified in the Bible as being synonymous with the land of Ramses, which is that area sort of in and around Avaris and P. Ramses. And it was said to be the best of the land. Well, interestingly enough, if you go there today, it's still an incredibly fertile spot. I mean, it's just it's one of the greenest spots you'll see in Egypt. You go there, it's nothing but fields and banana plantations, and it's just amazingly green for Egypt. Okay. Let's qualify that for Egypt. But today, even today, it still remains one of the most fertile places. That hasn't changed much. So when we take sort of the whole sort of shooting match here, the preponderance of evidence, I think that at least as far as the indirect evidence goes, that the narrative of Joseph is consistent with what we would expect from a king, from a dynasty of the second intermediate period. And even his relations where he's talking to the king directly, the local dialect would be Amoritic. So Joseph, being an Amoritic speaker, would have entered into the land and would have been able to easily converse with the king, because the Hyksos were an Amoritic dynasty. They were Amoritic Semites. They weren't Egyptians. So much of the local population would have spoken Amorite. So that's what I got for the indirect evidence for the internal evidence for Joseph. And we know that that entire area was heavily populated with Semitic people during the second intermediate period and well into the New Kingdom, at least up to the middle of the 19th dynasty.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Falk. Okay, I have some questions about stuff you talked about. What about earlier dream about from Joseph? He describes sun, moon, and stars. Does that fit in that period or what?
Well, it's not an Egyptian dream. Okay, that's not an Egyptian dream, but it is a dream that we would maybe expect from a dreamer of, say, in the Levant, where basically they're pastoralists and they're out and they're more viewing the stars. Egyptians were less into astrology than, say, maybe the Levantines were. So that dream of the stars and the brothers each being a star coming down and giving homage to him would be a prophetic dream that you would expect out of a Levantine culture.
All right. But how about a dream that you mentioned, Pharaoh dream? It's almost obvious that seven skinny cows are, let's say, 7 years of famine, right? How they don't know what's dream about? What's it?
Well, it's the Egyptian attitude about dream interpretation. It's not presumptuous.
Mhm.
It doesn't presume things. Dream interpretation has to follow a certain tradition. Like, for example, I mean, they still put a high value on dreams in Egypt today. I was told by Jim Hoffmeyer, he had a friend who called him up from Egypt, and he said, I had a really good dream about you. I dreamed that I saw you eating a bowl of meat, and that was a good dream. So there's a logic and a sense to Egyptian dream interpretation, but it's not presumptuous. It doesn't sort of make intuitive leaps. It has to follow either a tradition or, as I say, the manual. So this is where we get it. I mean, because we are more loosey goosey, heely feely about religion in our culture, we would make those intuitive leaps and not think anything of it. They didn't. They wouldn't presume to try to interpret the signs of the gods without consulting somebody at the temple. And the temple wouldn't dare to interpret your dream unless it was written down in the book.
Right. Okay. That's logical. Do you drive some connections between Sinuhe and the story of Joseph?
Um, well, Sinaway is earlier than Joseph. You're talking around the reign of Senwosret III. So that's a very different period of time. That you're talking Middle Kingdom at that point. So that's a couple hundred years before the Second Intermediate Period. So culturally, it is quite different. The king is reigning at Ichitawi in the Fayum, as opposed to at Avaris. The number of Semites is growing at the time in Egypt, but has not reached its peak yet. There's people still wandering off, say Libya and the Levant, that are escaping famine from the end of the Neolithic wet period at that point still. So at that point, people are starting to come in out of these hinterlands and inhabit the Delta region where they're going to hunt and fish and pasture their flocks.
Nice. Okay, where would you put years of famine and years of prosperity? Um, does it fit in any time of framework?
That one's really hard to say. And the reason it's hard to say is because Egypt had many cycles of famine and feast. The entire agricultural cycle in Egypt was dependent upon the levels of the Nile. So if they had a high Nile that year, they had a bumper crop. If they had a low Nile that year, they had famine. So the rains in East Africa can be unpredictable. And because they're unpredictable, the levels of the Nile would fluctuate over time. So famine was not an unusual event in Egypt. When we look at, say, the mummies that have survived, and when we talk about mummies here, we're talking the middle class up. Lower classes weren't mummified. So you're talking your middle and upper middle classes, even your upper classes here for mummification. And we find from the data that we see in the mummies that at least 30% of those individuals had undergone chronic malnutrition. So everyone was touched by famine at some point, in all likelihood. So it would be it was a remarkable thing if somebody actually lived their whole life without starving at some point. And the fact is that in Egypt, the fear of starvation was the biggest concern for the Egyptians. It was food scarcity that Egyptians worried about. And they worried about it all through their existence. So they worried about it in their current life and they worried about it in their afterlife. This is why mummification and the rituals to feed a mummy were so important, because there's nothing an Egyptian feared more than starving in the afterlife.
That's really interesting. Okay. Would you look those years like symbolic, 7 years?
Well, I think that Joseph took it in a literal fashion, that there would be 7 good years and then 7 bad years. Um, but whether or not that's exactly seven, who knows? Just because you have 7 bad years doesn't mean the eighth is going to be fantastic afterwards. So, and we don't have records of the famines either. So, because we don't have records of those, it's hard to know exactly when those took place.
Okay. Can we just speak about some side questions about character of Joseph? Because you mentioned that he had more brothers and sisters. And
Mm-hmm.
how do you view his character? Because it is described in one scene that some brothers attacked some people. I forgot, and it says in text that other brothers also joined in that. Is Joseph in that group or not?
No, he's not. He does not participate in the attack of the Hivites.
Yeah,
Okay. After the rape of Dinah.
yeah.
Okay. Now, um, Benjamin, and I think it's Levi, I think that participates in those attacks that kill the Hivites. Um, I think that's a very misunderstood passage. One of the things is that in clan societies, one of the things we notice in clan societies is that rape is often met with the wiping out of the entire tribe. And because if the entire tribe wasn't wiped out, it would be seen by everyone in the surrounding territory that your clan was too weak to defend itself. So it made you open game, put an open season on you. Benjamin understood this. Jacob didn't, or Jacob was too timid to do it. So while Jacob condemns Benjamin for doing this, he did what was right in sort of the view of clan society. And the fact is, too, the Hivites did conspire to marry and incorporate the sons of Jacob into their own society, kill them off, and take their stuff. That was the plan. So they weren't innocent, not by a long shot.
All right. So, what about the question that did he have more brothers and sisters? Also, Isaac, he had only one brother, I guess.
Yeah, Isaac only had one brother, Esau.
Yep. So, why do you think that Joseph have more brothers?
Isaac had more, or sorry, Joseph had more brothers because Jacob had more wives. Okay. Isaac only had the one wife. Okay. He only had the one wife. Jacob had two wives and two handmaids. So the 12 sons came from 4 women. So that's the reason why there was many more children from Jacob than say Isaac.
Oh, I understood that you said that there were more than 12. Okay, so my
Yeah,
mistake.
there would have been more than 12. There would have been daughters too.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Yeah, there'd be daughters too, but 12 sons.
Yeah.
The sons are named, the daughters are not.
All right. Okay. What about names? Can you just translate Potipharah, Joseph's Egyptian name, his wife, I guess. So, can you...
Yeah, sure. Potipharah means in Egyptian is Padi Ray. Okay. The one given by Ray. And Potiphar is just another Hebrew variation of the same name. So Potiphar and Potipharah both come from the Egyptian Padi Ray. Okay. Uh, Joseph's name is a little more difficult. Um, there's some transposed letters in there. So it's most likely to be a Jedpa, Netcher, and Ankh. Okay. Which is the God is spoken and he lives. Asenath comes from the name Is Neith, a child of Neith, who's a goddess. So it's a theophoric name.
Great. Okay. Does that fit in that period?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, we do find several names that begin with that. So those are very typical of general Egyptian names.
Yeah. Okay. What about 110 years? Does that fit in that specific period or what?
Yes, it does fit in that specific period as a an idiomatic age. All right. Let me explain what we mean by that. Okay. For example, there's a papyrus called Papyrus Westcar that relates some of the tales, the Middle Kingdom tales. And one of these is the tale of Jedi. And Jedi was a wise man. He was a poor but wise man. And he was said to live to 110 years. Now, no one thinks he actually lived to 110 years, but this is the Egyptian sort of canonical age for somebody who's a wise sage. So the fact that Joseph would be ascribed 110 years is much more of an indication that he was ascribed that wisdom, not so much that he lived that long. It's an achievement.
Mm-hmm.
It's an achievement, not a record of longevity.
Like Joshua, yeah.
Yeah, like Joshua, yeah. Or even Moses.
Mm.
I mean, it's not a coincidence that Moses lived 10 years longer than Joseph. It's that three groups of 40. So it creates a greater canonical age than, say, Joseph as, say, Israel's first savior. Moses being the greater savior is given the greater honor.
Okay, is it fair to say that in the time of King David and Solomon and after, we have real years, but before we have some ideal years in Judges and Exodus, and would you say like...
Yeah, we do have idiomatic idioms that are used sometimes when the author seems unsure of the exact count of years. Okay. Now, in the case of, say, the kings, that seems to happen during the split monarchy, not so much before. So during the United Monarchy, they're still using idiomatic reign lengths. Saul is ascribed 40 years. David is ascribed 40 years. Solomon is ascribed 40 years. Yeah. But after Solomon, we do get a true count of years. So all the successors of the divided monarchy do seem to be ascribed, say, true regnal years. But before the divided monarchy, it doesn't seem to be the case. But with that said, it's probably close. So Solomon probably reigned around 38.
Mhm. What about Moses and Joshua and of course Joseph? How long they lived actually? How would you say? How about?
We don't know in the case of Joseph
Mhm.
because we have no records of him. Really, even independent records, we don't even have that. In the case of Moses, it's a little easier to figure out. And the reason why is we can sort of narrow down his birth to around the time of King Ai, that 4-year reign. The reason why was the big fear at the time, and the reason why all the male children were killed is because the Egyptians feared that the Israelites would rise up and join their enemies in war. Egypt had no war from the time of the conquest of Avaris at the beginning of Dynasty 18 all the way till the end of the reign of Tutankhamun. Up until that point, Egypt was nothing but a conqueror, never faced the potential of being the conquered. With the death of King Tut, there was some palace intrigue over who gets to take the throne. And his widow, Anksunamun, asked the Hittite king, Supiluliluma I, to send a son to marry her to become king over Egypt. The two of the officials in Tut's court who were vying for the throne, the Vizier Ai and the General Horemheb, conspired to kill that prince, Hittite prince, on the way and take the throne for themselves. And that's what happened. And what happened is then this started a state of war between the Hittite Empire and the Egyptians that lasted 50 years. And that war begins with the reign of King Ai. So Moses would have probably have been born during those first 4 years of Ai's reign. So then we take that and then we extrapolate that to when the conquest would have occurred. We get, first of all, that we leap from there to say the Exodus that happens around 1263, 1265-ish, another 40-ish years then to enter into the promised land around 1220. And then we got to say a proximate date for the death of Moses. So in the case of Moses, he lives to around 90 years. That's his true age. But he doesn't live to the full 120.
Like Ramses the second, he was about 19, yeah?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Ramses dies, I think, just a couple years before Moses himself.
That's nice. Okay. Did you do you want to say about Joshua?
Joshua, we're not sure.
Not sure. Okay.
But again, it's one of those things where we're not exactly sure. He probably lived to a right old age in his 80s and 90s.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get back to Joseph. Okay. Can
Okay.
you unpack the title Overseer of House? Can you explain that?
Hmm. Okay. It's called in the Egyptian, it's a title called the Imira pair. And it literally just means overseer of the household. Imira is overseer, pair is house. It's a very, very common title in Egypt. Um, and basically, any sort of landowner who had any real property, who was a high official, they didn't take care of their own household. They had a slave who did it for them, or a servant who did it for them. And that servant was called the Imira pair, and he was in charge of making sure that the whole house was in order, that the crops were harvested properly from the fields, that they were put in the storeroom. An account was made of how much was collected for taxation purposes. He managed the affairs of the home. He made sure that the cook was doing her job, you know, the baker was doing his job. You know, that's what the Imira pair does. He organizes the house. He's the butler. He's the overseer of the day-to-day affairs that makes the household run. So it would have been a very, very common title for somebody who had any aptitude to organize and lead. If you could organize and lead, you were very, very likely to become an Imira pair. As I said, very common title. We find it all over the place in Egypt, in all periods of history.
Awesome. But was Joseph trained for that? Did he go at some school or something?
No, you didn't need to be trained for that role.
Mhm.
It was a hands-on role. To be an Imira pair was just a hands-on thing. So essentially, you would have worked as a slave for a certain amount of time. Somebody would have said, "Hey, you're good at organizing the other slaves. You're doing the job already. We'll just give you the title too." So that's more or less how it worked. Is just people of aptitude sort of rose up into it. There was no formal training for it.
What about later when he became a vizier? Did he get some school?
He might have. It's hard to say exactly how much formal training he would have had as vizier, but it's possible. There would have been a royal calf at Avaris, that there would have been some training of some kind. Whether or not he participated in that is unknown.
Fair enough. Okay. Um, Inspiring philosophy mentioned that Joseph used a cup of divination in Genesis 44:5. Sorry. Can you explain that? I didn't understand that argument.
Yes, it actually says in the text that he put his cup of divination in the bag of Benjamin.
Yep.
So these were cups that were used exactly for that purpose, as it is exactly as it is described. Now, we do have one of these cups of divination, and it was found in the tomb of King Tutankhamun. It's an alabaster cup about yay big, about the size of a football. It's a gorgeous, beautiful thing. It was actually found in the entranceway leading into the tomb. And what you would do is you would pour liquid into this, and you would stare into it until you saw an image. And that was your cup of divination.
Yeah.
So it does seem that Joseph did practice some of these arcane arts of Egypt.
Yeah. So this is specific for Egyptian culture, or
Yeah,
yeah.
this is specifically for Egyptian culture.
All right.
Egyptians did do this. We're not sure if the Levantines did, but we know the Egyptians did.
Okay. What about the jail, and does that fit in that time period?
Sure.
You mentioned that it was in open place in some
Yep.
desert or whatever. So,
Base- Prisons in Egypt were rock quarries. Okay. Basically, what they would do is they would make you part of a caravan and march you out to these rock quarries where you basically spent your day splitting rocks. There's nowhere to run because it's all desert around you. There's no oases, no water, no food. Everything has to be trucked in or brought in by donkey. Okay. So all the supplies have to be brought in, whether it's food, whether it's water, doesn't matter. It all's got to be brought in. So you can't run away. There's nowhere to go. So they don't need bars. They don't need walls. Everyone knows they're stuck there. And you're basically left there in a holding. I mean, it's basically a jail, not a prison. It's a jail. But it's the sort of jail where you're remanded until your case comes up for final judgment. Now, the problem is it's not like a regular court where your judgment comes up on a docket. It's whenever the king pretty much feels like looking at your case. That could be 6 days, 6 months, 6 years, 60 years, never. And that was fine by most prisoners because the normal sentence after that incarceration was the death penalty. So that was usually the normal result.
So when
Because frankly, most kings didn't care.
when the text says that he had 17 years, Joseph, is it
Mm-hmm.
real years or is it symbolic maybe?
I think it's real.
Mm.
That would not be uncommon for an Egyptian prison.
Yeah.
As I said, it's the sort of place that they put you in and just forget about you. You're an annoyance to the king. The king doesn't want to deal with this. He'd rather get drunk. I mean, he'd rather drink wine and, you know, ride his chariot and shoot bows and arrows. And, that's what a king would rather do in Egypt than sort of just judge criminal cases.
Mhm.
He did it on occasion because he had to do it, not because he wanted to do it. And then he usually picked and chose. It's like he would basically get warned at some point by his vizier, "Hey, Your Highness, that quarry over there is starting to have a population control problem. You need to judge some cases to thin out the herd." That's usually the point where the king would get involved and start judging some cases. But apart from that, not the kings most often didn't care about justice.
Yeah, I laughed, but that makes sense. Okay.
Very consistent with the time.
hmm
Very consistent.
Okay, and last a question of those sort my interests, and we move on objections. So, what about mummification? How Joseph died? Can you explain that?
He was mummified, just like Jacob was.
How do you know?
Uh, hmm?
How do you know?
Well, first of all, Jacob, we're told that Jacob was mummified, and we're told that he was mummified for 40 days of process and 30 days of mourning, and that's actually consistent with the mummification ritual from Egypt. So that's consistent with what we know of Egyptian mummification. We do know that the mummification process, which involved basically eviscerating the corpse, washing the corpse, and then covering it with natron to salt it for 40 days, was a normal part of the practice. And then it was wrapped. Usually the amulets were stuck into the wrapping, and then there was a mourning period followed by the burial.
Mm,
So when the biblical text does say that Jacob um, um, was mummified 40 days and then mourned for 30 according to Egyptian custom, that is true. exactly how the Egyptians did it.
Was Joseph a monotheist because he had a wife that was from Heliopolis and he was mummified? What do you say?
Hard to say. We're not sure. Uh, we do know that some of those patriarchs were not as monotheist as they should have been. Uh, Jacob and his wife stealing Laban's idols is probably a good example of this. Those were fertility idols, by the way. Um, so yeah, there is some nuance to that whole idea of how monotheistic was any of the patriarchs. You know, were they true monotheists? Were they henotheists? It's unclear. It's unclear. We do know that patriarchal religion was different than what we find later on practiced by the Israelites. A lot of the practices that were permitted during the time of the patriarchs become um, verboten at the Sinai covenant. So, with the giving of the law at Sinai, a lot of those practices came to the end.
Nice. Okay, we start now with objections from great scholars, but let's hear that. Dan McClellan said that
Mm-hmm.
Egypt influenced Israel until the 6th century BC. We see, for example, similar seals, art, and culture, and there was agreement between Hezekiah and Egypt. So perhaps the ruling elite knew Egyptian phrases, words, and thus they crafted a Bible full of Egyptisms. So what's your opinion about that?
It's a very McClellan type of objection. You give a half truth and then you give a half lie. Okay. It's a very McClellan type of objection. Okay. The half truth here is that Egypt was Israel's closest neighbor. Culturally, basically hegemonically, and the Bible does refer to Egypt over 500 times. There is no neighbor that had closer relations with Israel. That's true. Now, the influence of that relationship is going to rise and fall with the period of time. And I think this is where sort of McClellan misses the boat. He wants to kind of infer that there was, overwhelming Egyptian influence over the Israelites. And that's just not so. That's just not so. There is cultural exchange. They are trading, say, seals and artwork and all that stuff. But they also have their independent existence as well. If we find, for example, say during the 14th century BC, Egypt has very strong control over the Levant and strong hegemonic control. So they've set up at that point garrison cities that essentially enforce Egyptian policies and taxation through tribute. However, after Dynasty 18, and say beginning at during the reign of Ramses II, that hegemony starts to decline to the point where they lose it entirely by the reign of Ramses IV. And what happens to their presence in the Levant then is it shrinks back to virtually nothing. Yes, they still have a few garrison cities out there, but they're isolated outposts. They're not a threat to anybody. And while they survive a few hundred years after they lose control of the Levant, these cities are doomed, as it were, without Egyptian support. So when we look at, say, I mean, even say we look at the conquest of Shoshank, Shishak in the Bible, you know, Shishak is not establishing a permanent presence in Canaan. He's just going for a grocery run. Essentially, he's raiding the Levant for what he can steal and take back to Egypt. So he's not establishing a permanent presence there anymore. The fact is that even, say, during the height of the Egyptian hegemony, which was, say, during Dynasty 18, the city states of the Levant were mostly independent. The only thing that the Egyptians ever wanted out of the Levant was loot. That's all they wanted, was loot, and it was to shore up their inflation. Egypt had this terrible problem of 3,000 years of inflation. So they needed to steal stuff from other people to shore up that inflation, increase the supply of goods to keep the cost of goods down. So that's how they viewed their interactions with the Levant. Egypt didn't share its cultural, how do I say this, richness. It wasn't an expansion of culture. So, for example, when they would go to the Levant, they didn't train people how to speak Egyptian. They didn't train people how to write Egyptian. They used the local Akkadian or the local Canaanite dialects. So when they sent out their scribes to the various garrison towns, they sent them out knowing that they would pick up the local language. They had no interest in enculturating people to Egyptian. So then when we trace back to see what McClellan does here, which is he wants to claim that, say, the Bible was written during the Babylonian exile, but as a clever fraud where it's Egyptianizing. Okay? It's sort of it's one thing to claim that the texts were being purposely Egyptianized, but it's another thing to claim that that happened during the Persian period. Yeah, because we don't see any Persianisms in the Pentateuch. So it's kind of having your cake and eat it too. It's like, oh, well, these texts were written in the Babylonian exile, after the Babylonian exile, during the Persian period, but it's a clever fraud of Egyptianized texts. And somehow they managed such a clever fraud, that they managed to exclude all the Persianisms.
Okay, that's nonsense.
Yeah, it is nonsense. It is nonsense. And this is one of the things about that linguistic argument that sort of cuts both ways. I mean, a lot of this say, this objection is to sort of overcome the idea that there's Egyptian vocabulary, and a lot of it in the Torah. Okay? It's to overcome that. But they also forget the flip side of that argument, is that where we have post-exilic texts, and we do have post-exilic texts, they're full of Persian vocabulary. And yet the Torah has no Persian vocabulary.
Yeah, so what?
so okay, yeah. You have to, I mean, this would be an amazing fraud. Amazing. I mean, people don't write like this. People don't write like this. I mean, we write today, and it's very, I mean, that's one of the things, is it's very difficult to perpetuate a fraud, especially one that's sufficiently old enough. Because one of the things is that when we talk about, these sorts of things. Our own experiences of our contemporary culture feed into our writing. We take what we understand today and it's invisible for us. Most of us will write that Christopher Columbus settled in America. Well, America wasn't called America at the time of Columbus. That's an anachronism. That's a retrojection. The retrojection caused by our current knowledge. People at the time, in the ancient times, did the same thing. We see a lot of retrojection in Genesis that tells us exactly when it was written. And in fact, if anything, the evidence that we have from the Torah is that scribes tried to contemporize the language. They changed the grammar to make it more current, more Semitic, more, and they did this not just to say the vocabulary, but they did this to the grammar. So we do see textual changes in the Torah, but it's not to make it more Egyptian. It's to make it more Israelite. So the idea of the clever fraud just sort of falls down on all counts. It doesn't make a bit of sense.
Yep, I agree.
And it doesn't even make a sense with their own presuppositions.
Yeah, that sounds like they have a bias, but they don't want to admit that they have bias.
No, they don't.
Yeah. Let's go next. Dr. Ronald Handel said that loan words are not a good argument. He can tell many stories that are totally not true, but throw in some props that look like they are real. Or maybe are real. He says, imagine Shakespeare talking some historical facts about Roman period. So is it good analogy?
Well, Ronald Handel's arguments here are very strange. They're very strange. This is an argument from imagination, okay? But imagination is not evidence. If I can imagine that the moon is made of cheese, why can't the moon be made of cheese? This, of course, in no way shows that the moon is made of cheese. It, one way or the other, just because I can imagine it is not evidence for the moon being a dairy product or not. It's just imagination. It's not evidence. So imagine Shakespeare talking about some historical facts about the Roman period. That does not in any way prove the origins of the Torah one way or the other. It's a non-argument because imagination isn't evidence.
Okay, but he continues and he says, for example, Egyptian word for linen doesn't prove anything because we also have, even today, some nice sheets made of Egyptian cotton. Egypt was a major superpower and economic power, so Egyptian names mean nothing. For example, we have people called Boris and or Natasha, but it doesn't mean that story about Boris and Natasha originated in Russia.
Oh, when I saw these, I just cracked up. Okay. Um, okay, let's talk about that linen sheet argument first. Okay. I think the first thing is he confuses material culture with the inheritance of vocabulary. Now, if we have a nice cotton sheet, how does that anyway impact the etymology of the vocabulary. It doesn't. Second, the word cotton itself comes from the Arabic katan, okay? Which shows that a word from Arabic vocabulary has entered into English vocabulary. It's not like it doesn't show nothing at all. So, while having an Egyptian cotton sheets doesn't mean that the Egyptians were involved in the production of said sheets, it does prove that there has been some linguistic interaction between Arabic and English. So to state that it proves nothing at all shows a complete ignorance of how linguistic borrowing works. Now, the Boris and Natasha thing. Oh, I got a kick out of that one. And, he's right by itself. If you had two characters named Boris and Natasha, it does not mean that the story originated in Russia. That's true. But if you have two characters named Boris and Natasha, it doesn't mean it has nothing to do with Russia at all. This is a composition fallacy. It's basically taking something very specific and applying it to something very general. So he's taking something specific, which is a story about Natasha and Boris, and saying that because in the specific case, Boris and Natasha a story may not originate in Russia, to apply it to all Boris and Natashas. In the general case, to say it has nothing to do with Russia at all. That's the general case. That's a composition fallacy. So then, what does it do? Then we have to ask the question, well, what does Boris and Natasha, does it have any connection to Russia? And it does. They're Russian names. They're names that originate from Russia. So it's one thing to say that just because you have two characters with those names, that the story doesn't originate there. It doesn't mean that it has no significance at all. Boris and Natasha are Russian names. There is a connection to Russia. Maybe not a strong connection, perhaps a very weak connection. We can always debate what is the extent of that connection. But to say there's no connection, that's overstating a claim. And I think that's what he does here. Now, I think what Handel has done with these objections is create a cognitive load that's very difficult to circumvent. Okay. So let's say, for example, we grant him the objection that personal names are not proof of an Egyptian origin to the narrative. Okay, fair enough. Well, then what about the place names that demonstrate intimate local geographic knowledge specific to the Ramesside time period? All right, he's got to then say, well, that doesn't constitute proof. Okay, fair enough again. Then what about the cultural information that would have only been familiar to those living in Egypt? Mummification times, the chain of gold, the special clothes, the seal bearer, the birth bricks, the carrying of cylindrical objects like bread bowls on the shoulders. There's a lot of cultural information in there that is specific to living in Egypt that was never transported to Israel. So then what we have here, and then again, that's a degree of specificity again. Well, okay, maybe that's coincidence. Maybe they shared that information with somebody in the garrison towns. Okay, what about the local construction of furniture, which follows an Egyptian design pattern. The wood with covered in metals, foils like gold and bronze. That's specifically an Egyptian design type. What about the attitudes, such as Egyptians hating shepherds and hating won't sit and eat with foreigners, or the religious understandings, such as the forms of worship that were done, such as at Heliopolis. So, there comes a point when these pieces of information build up an inductive case. And to deny it's all a coincidence or doesn't supply proof requires greater and progressively more special pleading. And that's what Handel has done here, is he's creating a greater and greater artifice of special pleading to discount the inductive case. And the inductive case would say that these events are more likely to happen than not. So I think Handel's objections will ultimately fail because it all boils down to special pleading. It all boils down to special pleading.
Wow, great answer. It is coincidence that my sister is Natasha, so we are from Serbia, and it's funny. That name is more generic, I would say.
Probably.
Especially in 21st century, we cannot compare.
I mean, names move around.
Yeah.
They do go from place to place. But you look up the etymology of it, and it is Russian. But I know because I looked it up prior. That's okay, But we do borrow names. That is done. Mary. We think of like Mary as being, say, the name of the mother of Jesus. Good Israelite of the line of Judah. But that name itself is an Egyptian name. It comes from Miriam, and Miriam comes from the Egyptian Marie, which means beloved. It's a name that's been passed down through history, but it's still an Egyptian name.
Yes, Bitak said that name Jacob, it's generic through all history. So that
yeah, it's a very common name. Jacob is a very common name, and it's a common theophoric name. And we even find some scarabs of a 14th dynasty king whose name is Jacob Hor. Horus has helped. So we do find it throughout history. It is a common Jacob is a common Semitic name.
Yeah, so is it fair to compare those names Natasha in 21st century with Potipharah and maybe some rare names in Pentateuch? So I don't see that.
Well, here's the thing. We do say Natasha. We've got there's enough, say, variance in our culture that we would say, yeah, okay, doesn't necessarily in the specific case apply to a story originating in Russia. I mean, if you're a fan of the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons, that story originates in Canada, but it comes out of the Cold War. So there is still, even with that, even though it's a story originating in Canada, it still has a Russian connection. In the case of, say, the Pentateuch, when we look at, say, Potipharah and Potiphar, these are Egyptian names set in Egypt. At the time, we would expect them to be in Egypt, doing Egyptian things. There's a lot of Egypt in those texts. So in order for them to sort of escape the gravity of all that mountain of data, they also have to build a mountain of special pleading.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so Ehrman says something similar with a discussion with Peter Williams. He argues that some place names, some persons and botanics and a lot of stuff points that those writers were really experiencing that and yeah, going through that story. So
Oh yeah, because frankly, some of those places are very obscure.
yeah,
Like Pihahi Road, it's not on a major highway. It's in the hinterland. If you look at where that would have taken place, it would have been southeast of the Pelusiac estuary. It's not on a major highway. You got a major highway that's north of there that goes from Migdol, the Lion's Den, and Charu to Piramsi. But Pihai Road is not on that path. The next major road down south is from the way of Shur, and that goes way south of that in past the Wadi Tumalot into Heliopolis. Pihai Road is this little watchtower watching post in the middle of nowhere. And it's even only referenced in one Egyptian text. So there's a there's cities, there's little towns in there that's not part of the beaten track, like Balsavan. Balsavan is not on a major highway. You would have to go out into the wilderness, basically, or hug the coastline of the Plusiac estuary to encounter those towns. It's not a road. They're kind of in the middle of nowhere. So for you to even know about them, you'd have to go off off the major highways. So it's not something your typical geographer in Babylon is going to know about.
okay, maybe they want just the right story. Yeah. Okay. So Peter Williams wrote about New Testament. So Ehrman said that he can speak about some imaginary fictitious story with description of real places and names from that period. So that
That's
doesn't.
that argument of imagination.
Yeah, this is similar.
Exactly the same argument.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can imagine a story where I do everything historically accurate. Yeah. Good luck, dude. Look, I've done fiction writing. I've done fiction writing. It's really, really hard to do a 100% authentic historical piece where you get every detail exactly right and then do it in the original language. Good luck. Good luck. Well, this is the problem with the argument from imagination too, is you can imagine anything, whether or not it's actually true. It doesn't have to be a true representation of reality to be part of your imagination. And because of that, you're using hypotheticals, not evidence. And I think this is an etymology, a fallacy that we do see repeated, especially in more speculative literature, where people tend to don't have the evidence but want to make a case, say, against a proposition. They'll often use the argument from imagination.
Yes, I agree. Okay. So when we look at Quran and the Exodus story from that book, we see, I believe, about three stuffs. I believe Egypt, Moses, and maybe Aaron or Mary. So we don't have a lot of place names or uh, Egyptian names or cultures and something. So would that be proof that fictitious story don't mention that things?
Well, Quran is very late. It's very, very late. I mean, you're talking 7th century. So, there you're just not going to get, say, the persistence of memory or documentation that you would have had with, say, writings that are closer to the period in time. Now, that doesn't mean that the closest documents are going to be the most accurate necessarily. In fact, the way that history writing seems to work best is it almost works kind of like a focal length, where if you're too close to the events, you don't get the entire story. If you're too far away, you lose detail. So, in that respect, it's very much like a camera lens. There's a sweet spot where history is best recorded. And when you start talking about something that is 2,000 years after the fact, details get awfully hazy, awfully quick. This is why I don't say trust the writings of Josephus for the Exodus. He gets a lot of stuff wrong. But in Josephus's case, he's writing 1,300 years after the fact. But you add another 700 on top of that, well, then now you're really out of focus.
Let's talk about Josephus for a moment. Is it that traditional date for Exodus? Let's say early Exodus, because he plays Exodus in time of Hyksos. But you, in your book, mentioned that traditional view of Exodus is late Exodus by some rabbis in the second century. So,
Yeah, Rabbi Hanasi dates it late.
yeah.
Now, that's, of course, because they're doing the Seder Olam Rabbah to do their dating, which cuts out 2 centuries out of the chronology. So their chronology tends to be a lot later than that. Now, that said, however, at the same time, too, Josephus is relying on a particular recension of Manetho to get a lot of his his Exodus information. The problem is that his recension of Manetho isn't the only one out there. It's one of 4, and they're all different. We have 7 texts for Manetho, 4 of which mention the Exodus, and each one's different regarding who was basically when the Exodus took place. Like, for example, in Josephus's copy, he places it with the with King Amenhotep II, and that's very much in line with the early Exodus date. But there are other recensions of it. This is copies of it as well, like Julius Africanus's one. It talks about a different king. We got Theophilus' version is a different one again, and so we have 4 kings mentioned as potential kings of the Exodus: Ahmose I, Amenhotep II, Akhenaten is mentioned as a potential candidate, and Tutmosis IV is mentioned as a potential candidate. All of which comes from different versions of Manetho. Which one's the right one? We don't know, because we don't have a tiebreaker for the text criticism. They're all different. They seem to all come from different source documents. We don't know which one's the correct version of Manetho. And it's looking like a strong possibility that none of them are correct. That all four of those documents have been altered by a Jewish or Christian writer to include the Exodus in that text. Because when you've got a text and they all disagree at the exact same place, the likelihood is that none of them are correct. That the original document didn't have any reference to the Exodus. So when we look at that and we see that, we have to say at that point, okay, this is a Ptolemaic, a 3rd century BC Ptolemaic priest. He's an Egyptian priest. What does this guy care about Exodus? Zip.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, let's move next. Who sold Joseph? His brothers, the Midianites, or Ishmaelites?
Okay. Yes.
What?
The answer to that is yes. Okay. Genesis 37:28 basically states that the Midianites and the Ishmaelites are synonyms. And if you think about this, this makes a lot of sense. Okay. And the reason is because to be a Midianite is a regional ethnonym. It's an ethnonym of region, like saying a Levantine. It tells you what region it comes from. The Ishmaelites is a tribal ethnonym. That tells you what tribe it's from. Ishmaelites occupied the region of Midian, which is Saudi Arabia, Edom, and the eastern side of the Sinai Peninsula. So Midian actually encompassed a lot more during the Second Intermediate Period than it did in later points in time. So Midian actually encompassed all those territories. And the people that occupied Midian, which again includes Saudi Arabia, Edom, and the western or eastern Sinai, were Ishmaelites. So they're one and the same. They're just different terms for the same groups of people. One talks about where their origin is, the other one talks about what their tribe is. So that's the distinction. So that's why Genesis 37:28 treats them as synonyms. Treats them as synonyms. So what happens is that in verse 28, Joseph is sold by his brothers to the Midianites, which also happen to be Ishmaelites, because the two groups are one and the same. And then that group resells Joseph to Potiphar in verse 36. So the whole idea that these are two different groups is complete nonsense. The text treats them like synonyms. And given what we know about the region at the time, it makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. This makes a lot of sense. Okay. Now, Michael Heiser said that Genesis 41:14 said before Joseph meets Pharaoh, he puts on new clean clothing and shaves himself.
Yeah.
Native Egyptians were clean shaven and found facial hair offensive. So that doesn't fit actually with Hyksos. What's your opinion about that?
The fact is that the Hyksos probably did shave. Now, the fact is that it wasn't that facial hair was offensive. There were Egyptians that did have facial hair. They tended to be of the lower classes, though. The reason Egyptians shaved was not because of offense, but it was because of sanitation. It was a form of lice control. So, to control the rampant spread of lice, Egyptians would shave all the hair, their head, their eyebrows, their underarms, everywhere. They just shaved off all their hair to prevent the transmission of lice. But the lower classes would sometimes not shave. And that was because a lot of them couldn't afford razors. Razors were made of bronze. Bronze is expensive. So people in, say, the poorest farming classes would sometimes go unshaven just because of the cost. You know, when you have a blanket and a bowl and a spoon, and that's all your worldly possessions, you're not buying a razor. So a lot of this will just depend upon class. And it's not so much that it was offensive. It was just, as I say, this is a sanitation thing. And Joseph is being presented to the king. He stinks. He's been wearing the same set of clothes for 17 years. He smells bad. He looks bad. He's unshaven. He's unkempt. He's not someone you'd present to good company at that point. Dude needs a bath.
That's honest answer. Okay, but I heard the explanation that maybe Hyksos were identified like Egyptians. Maybe they take some customs of them of
Oh
Egyptians.
yeah, oh yeah. They did take customs from Egyptians. They did Egyptianize. They did Egyptianize, but they weren't completely Egyptian either. So in some respects, like for example, to shave, they would shave. The Hyksos would shave. They wouldn't keep your typical Semitic beard because, again, the problem with lice would have affected them just as much as it would have affected everyone else there. So, you know, that's going to be an issue for them. But they weren't completely Egyptianized either. They did retain their, for example, their knowledge of the Amoritic language. So that whole area could speak Amoritic. We do find this in a lot of, say, the small text finds that we find at Avaris, is that, say, Amoritic imperfective names are maintained amongst the material culture. So we do find that they maintained some of their customs, but not others. The Hyksos kings had still herds of sheep, even though Egyptians in general hated herdsmen. They hated shepherds. And the reason why is they hated shepherds is because sheep polluted waterways. It's for the same reason they hated people who raised pigs. Because the Egyptian agriculture was highly dependent upon canals to move water deeper and deeper inland. So if you had some pig farmer out at the beginning of the canal polluting the water downstream, you didn't have very happy neighbors. Sheep also polluted waterways, not in the ways that, say, cows do. Cows are actually very, very, how would I say it, innocuous to waterways.
Okay, great. So when we read in text Egyptians, can we understand that as Hyksos in narrative of Joseph? Because
No,
nope.
no. Um, the Egyptians were culturally distinct. Now, here's the thing: when we talk about the Hyksos themselves, they were Amorites. They were right, Amorites. They were Semites. They were still culturally Semites, even though they had Egyptianized. They maintained non-Egyptian practices, like, for example, they were henotheists that worshiped Baal. They didn't equally worship the entire Egyptian pantheon. So they did maintain a cultural identity. They would also pillage Egyptian graves and desecrate them. So there weren't good Egyptians as such, but within their ranks, they would have Egyptian administrators, Egyptian functionaries, and those people would be easily offended. But the Hyksos did rely on their Egyptian functionaries to carry out their bidding. So they would have had Egyptians that were courtiers, officials, maybe generals to do their will. But they themselves were Amorites. So the Egyptian king would probably have not been offended that Jacob was a shepherd. But oh boy, his court would have. That was who was helping the Hyksos to rule. Were Egyptian, say, minor officials, regional governors, those sorts of things. You couldn't rule Egypt without the support of the regional governors. And they would have been Egyptian.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just now realized that. Okay, Joseph's new wife, reward of Pharaoh, is said to be the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. This is argument of Michael Heiser. So On was a center of solar worship in ancient Egypt. The Hyksos worshipped Set, trickster figure often identified with Baal. So that's
Okay.
sounds like contradiction, right?
Well, okay. First of all, Set is not a trickster figure. He's not a trickster figure. I don't know where Heiser gets that from. It's not in the mythology anywhere. So I don't know how he got that. As far as the Hyksos, they were Baal worshippers. They had a temple at they had a couple temples dedicated to Baal and to Set at Avaris. Seth was really a god of power and a god of storms. That's really what he is, and that's why he's associated with Baal, because Baal was also a storm god. Okay. Now, at Heliopolis, the main god was Atum Re. Atum Re is a composite solar deity. Now, with that said, intermarrying between various religious sects happened frequently. Okay. It happened frequently. It wasn't uncommon for a priest of Ptah to marry a priestess of Hathor. These sort of intercult marriages happened all the time in Egypt. It was not an impediment for two people to marry of different faiths in Egypt. It just happened all the time.
Yeah, okay. So, do we have evidence that Joseph made law until this day in Genesis 47:26 that Pharaoh get fifth part?
Yes, that's actually probably true. The ideal taxation rate in Egypt was 20%. Now, in practice, it tended to be more like 20 to 30%. And that the reason is because the way taxation was done in Egypt. Now, the way it was done was essentially you're taxed before your crop is done, not after. So every year the river floods and they take a measurement off of something called a nilometer. And using that measurement, they can predict how much your crop should be for a plot of land based upon the level of the flooding. And then they tax you 20% based upon that expected output. So your taxes were determined before you actually earn the income. So if you happen to have a bad crop year, your taxes went up because the amount didn't change. You got the lease of the land, you're expected to produce X amount of crops. You are going to give 20% of that regardless of that expectation, which could be 20%, it could be 30%, which is why the range is generally between 20 and 30% because of the variance of the actual production of the land. Now, if you were a craftsman, they would just take 20% of what you produced that year, a flat 20%. So if you were any sort of, say, like if you made sandals and you made 100 sandals that year, the government would take 20. So that's how it worked normally. So if you were a craftsman, if you had a trade, they would take that clean 20% off the top. If you were a farmer, they would predict 20% of your expected crop, which you were expected to produce. If you failed, you might end up paying more.
Amazing. I didn't know that. So even in the time of Hyksos?
Yeah, even in the time of Hyksos. In fact, one of the things that's complained about by, say, Akmosa and his predecessor Kamosa is the high taxation of the Hyksos. So prior to the Hyksos, taxation was lower. It was a lot lower. It was about a tenth. So it was a tenth instead of say a fifth. So they're doubling the taxation essentially. And the Hyksos get very wealthy off of this. They get very wealthy. When Avaris is finally conquered by Akmosa, they find ships at the harbor full of goods that the Hyksos were going to trade across the Mediterranean. All sorts of precious metals and furniture and the whole 9 yards. Yeah, they got very wealthy off of that taxation. And that taxation remains in place until the time of the Assyrian conquest.
Okay, so do we find that Hyksos rulers were more rich and powerful than previous pharaohs?
No, and all likely not as rich or powerful. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs, especially the ones of Dynasty 12, were exceptionally powerful. The Senwosrites especially managed to do campaigns into the Levant, bring back lots of loot. They were very powerful. They didn't set up, say, garrison towns like the kings of, say, Dynasty 18. Like Tutmosis III, when he does his conquest, he's going to set up garrison towns to keep the tribute coming in. The kings of Dynasty 12 aren't going to do that. They're just going to campaign, steal what they can, and bring it home. But as a result of that, they get very rich, very powerful, and they build vast monuments as a result.
Okay, so how that fit in a Joseph narrative? Because it seems like Joseph made Pharaoh rich more than previous pharaohs. I get that sense. So what do you think?
Okay, what Joseph did that previous pharaohs weren't able to do was grab all the land. So because the famine was exceptionally severe, through time, land had been parceled out as a result of political favors, some of it to religious institutions. And so the kings did not have much control over land themselves. It all been all given away. So what happens is at the time of the Hyksos, when Joseph has his scheme to basically save the country from famine, He does so by exchanging those land grants for grain. So without the water coming in, that land does you no good. You can't eat off of it. So what he does is he exchanges the titles of the land for the grain and picks up all that land. And we do see evidence of this in some of the there's a biography of Ramosa, which basically talks about how with the conquest of Akmosa gets the land grants back through conquest and then divvies them up to his generals, to his officers. So there's an allusion to this land grab in the early documents of, say, Dynasty 18, where Akmos's conquest breaks up that Hyksos land monopoly that Joseph established.
Amazing. Okay, quick question about Bar Yusuf. Um, they say that that's a waterway of Joseph. What do you think?
I think that's a late naming that occurred during the Islamic era. Okay. Prior to Islam, that waterway was called the Merware, the Great Canal. It's well attested in Egyptian documents. It was never called the Bar Yusuf Canal prior to Islam's invasion.
Okay. So is it possible, beside this Bar Yusuf, that maybe Joseph made some channels or whatever?
Mm, well, most of those waterways had already been established by the Middle Kingdom, by Dynasty 12. The Dynasty 12 was a really big into creating canals. They drained the Fayoum and put in canals in there, basically turning those hunting and fishing grounds into arable land. So they were the ones who were really big on that. Hydrology had been an important function of kings, and going all the way back to, say, the first dynasty, we see an example of this on the Scorpion Mace Head, which is Dynasty 0. And the Narmer Palette, we see a waterway being constructed by Narmer. So there's early on in Egypt's history, hydrology was already a very important and royal activity. So when, say, Senwosret II does his modifications to the Fayoum, he's following up on those traditions of the early kings of Egypt. But not every king does that.
All right. Next question. Does the prison as a punishment for a slave who tries to molest a mistress fit into that framework period of Egypt?
Sure. Here's the thing. In Egypt, you could beat a slave to an inch of his life. Okay. You could beat you can beat the snot out of a slave and no one would think twice about it. You couldn't kill a slave. That was forbidden. But you had to do something with slaves that behaved badly. So what people did was they sent him to prison. Let Pharaoh deal with him. He's now gone. He's now on death row. In the end, he's going to get his comeuppance. Only a matter of time before Pharaoh deals with him or forgets about him. Either way is good. It's totally consistent with Egyptian justice. That's how it worked. You couldn't take the life of a man, even a slave. It was just something that was not permitted in that context.
That's cool. If Joseph is dated to the time of the Hyksos, why are the Hyksos haters of herdsmen and do not eat with them, etc.?
Hyksos didn't. Hyksos didn't care. It's basically, the text doesn't say that the Hyksos hated herdsmen. It's the Egyptians that did. Okay? So, and Hyksos weren't Egyptians. It's the Egyptians that hated shepherds. It's Egyptians that wouldn't eat with foreigners. These are Egyptian biases. And the Hyksos had to work with Egyptian functionaries. So to keep peace in their court, they basically accommodated Egyptian biases. They themselves didn't care. They're Amorites. They don't give a flying fig about Egyptian customs. They're just keeping the peace so that they get their work done. Their goals.
I noticed that many questions are just bad reading of the Bible, actually. Yeah, so okay.
You notice that, huh?
Yeah.
Hey, look, I'm often asked, what objection do do you find most concerning about the Exodus? And I said, I don't find any of the objections. I said, I have more of a problem with people not reading the freaking text.
Yep.
You know, read the book. And I mean, and this is not just on, say, a lay level. This is among scholars these days. They're not reading the Bible anymore. I heard this interview on Pelagia with Pelagia and Bart Ehrman, and they're ragging on Titus Kennedy. And okay, yeah, fair enough. He's someone that's a good target to rag on because he's pretty ignorant. But there comes to a point in the interview where he talks about Kennedy talks about the death of the firstborn, and Ehrman goes, "Death of the firstborn. What does that have to do with the Exodus?" And I'm going, you're here on this channel commenting about the Exodus, and you don't know what the death of the firstborn has to do with the Exodus. Ever heard of the Passover, dude? The guy hadn't read the text in 20 years. He'd forgotten the story.
Yeah.
That's the problem I face most of the time when I engage these topics is people stopped reading the text. They don't read the text, and when they do read the text, they don't read it carefully. And they don't read it in its ancient context.
Yes.
So most of the sort of the objections are as a result of either logical fallacy, poor reading skills, poor exegesis.
Yeah, I noticed also that you spend more time on answering about early Exodus, let's say Ron Wyatt and David Roll. So that are all people who believe in Exodus, and you spend a little time just about skeptics. So that's irony almost.
Well, it is almost an irony. But again, the skeptics have their sort of problems too. A lot of them are, in some ways, it's a little easier to deal with a skeptic because in a lot of ways it's more ignorant. It's a more ignorant. I mean, I had a skeptic once ask me, if all these Israelites went out in the wilderness, you know, where did they get the cloth to make their clothing? Uh, they had sheep. You figure it out. Yeah, but how did they make the cloth? With a loom, which is like a few sticks and some rocks. Lots of sticks and rocks out of the Sinai. But where did they get the leather for shoes? You had a plague that killed the cattle in the fields. You think they're just going to let it all rot out there? No, they're going to tan the leather. They're going to they're going to walk away with a bunch of leather and dried salted meat.
I'm gonna die. Okay.
Like Have you thought about this at all? But that's the sort of objections you get from atheists, is people who have this sort of surface reading of the text, but really haven't thought about it to any great degree. So, in some ways, it's easier to engage an atheist on this because they don't know that they have misread the text. And then you point it out to them and they get, well, okay, some of them will get, oh, yeah, I suppose that's where it came from. Good thinking. Very smart. Whereas, say, the Ron Widers, the David Rolls, the early Exodus people, they're very doctrinaire. You know, it you can give them the evidence, but they just aren't going to believe it. They just aren't going to believe it because they have a prior faith commitment where they will say, stand upon that commitment. You know, in the case of David Roll, they're committed to that chronological revisionism. And no amount of evidence that you can show, which is, I mean, you can easily show that David Roll's chronology is internally inconsistent. Not hard to do. It's really easy to do. But they won't buy it because they've already bought into the conspiracy theory that scholars have been tinkering with the chronology. And you know, once you get into that conspiratorial thinking, it's very hard to dissuade. You know, same with the Ron White group people. You know, the Ron White people think that archaeologists are the tools of Satan. Well, it's really hard to have a discourse with somebody who thinks you're the tool of Satan.
Yeah.
And those who, you know, hold to the early Exodus date, you know, their beef is that people who support a late Exodus, they think are compromising the Bible. So to them, we're biblical compromisers. You know, the tools of liberal theologians. So you've got people who think you're part of the great conspiracy. You have people who think that you're part of the hand of Satan, and you've got people who think you're the instrument of liberal theology. This is a very difficult, tough crowd to try to engage.
Okay, is it hard for you to just uh, going through all this stuff? Maybe you get some offended messages and threatening or something. Is
Oh
it?
yeah, I get threats. I get threats. I mean, I don't get death threats often, thank God, but I've gotten threats. I've gotten a lot of people saying that I'm damned to hell, that I'm going to burn. I had one guy who basically said to me that, you know, because I contradicted the word of Ron Wyatt, that I would be burning in hell and he would be laughing in glee as I was burning. Ooh, dude, that's cold. That's cold.
Unbelievable. Okay, let's continue with Joseph. Okay, and we are heading to
Sure.
the end. Okay, if Joseph is from the Hyksos period, was the relationship between the Pharaoh and the Egyptian priests at Heliopolis good enough for the Pharaoh himself to marry his advisor to the daughter of a priest from On?
Well, by the time Joseph comes to Egypt and is established within the court of the king, the Hyksos had established their control throughout the entire Nile Valley, from the delta all the way up to the outskirts of Thebes. Heliopolis is well within that territory. So there would have been nobody would have been bucking the king at that point. not within that range of control. So a political marriage at that point would have easily been possible.
Okay, nice. Um, Now, I read Finkelstein in his book Bible on Earth, and he says there are problems with camels. So the stories, I quote, from the patriarchs are packed with camels, usually herds of camels, but as in the story of Joseph's sale by his brothers into slavery, camels are also described as beasts of burden used in caravan trade. And we know from archaeological research that camels were not domesticated as beasts of burden earlier than the late second millennium and were not widely used in that capacity in the ancient Near East until well after 1000 BC. What's your thought?
My thought that this has been an objection that was refuted 20 years ago. It just keeps coming up. It is the evidence against it is so overwhelming at this point that anybody who still believes this garbage um, sort of deserves what they get to be laughed at. Um, but let's just go over some of the things that have been found. Okay, a camel skull was found in the Fayum that dates to the Pottery A period occupation, which is circa 2000 to 1400 BC. A camel jaw was found in a Middle Bronze tomb at Tel El Farad North that dates to circa 1900 to 1550 BC. From North Syria, a cylinder seal that dates to the 13th century BC shows deities on a camel. Camels are mentioned in the Sumerian lexical work Ara Habulu, dating to this early second millennium. We find a figure of a camel from a tomb that dates to the later part of the 13th century BC. From Northwest Arabia on a potsherd, a so-called Midianite ware, there's a broken figure of a camel that dates to the 13th, early 12th centuries, and a camel is depicted on an early 13th century chart from P. Ramses. Now, from an article by Berger, Ciani, and Fay, titled The Old World Camels in a Modern World, Balancing Act Between Conservation and Genetic Improvement in Animal Genetics, Volume 50, 2019. I quote, based on archaeological and pictorial evidence, the period of Bactrian camel domestication has been estimated as beginning in the late 4th, early 3rd millennium before Common Era, end quote. While the camel is not a common animal, it's also not anachronistic or unknown during the period of 2000 to 1100 BC. This is just a garbage objection that just keeps being brought up. It's been debunked 20 years ago, and it still is no better today than it was back then. There's writers that have been talking about the domestication of a camel dating back to the 4th millennium BC since 1994. 1994. It's 30 years ago. And that's a Jay Peters article. So, this is not this should have been laid to rest. The fact that this keeps getting brought up is just astounding. I can hardly believe that this objection still keeps being raised because it's been put to rest so many times it's not even funny.
Yeah, okay, nice. This is just outdated. Okay, but he continues and even more, he says, telling detail The camel caravan carrying gum, balm, and myrrh in the Joseph story reveals an obvious familiarity with the main products of lucrative Arabian trade that flourished under the supervision of the Assyrian Empire in the 8th and 7th century BC. End quote.
So what? Yeah, okay. Yeah, these were always valuable commodities. It's not just, these are not the commodities that are just exclusive to Assyrians. They've been taking, gum out of, say, Africa for millennia. These trades were, yes, there was an incense trade in Arabia, but there was also an incense trade coming out of Africa. And they're using camels to do that transport as well. This is why we find images of camels in Egypt when the Egyptians did not domesticate or particularly breed camels. You don't find a lot of camels, in Egypt, other than the ones that occasionally die there or occasionally drawn. But they're not common animals in Egypt, and yet they have passed through, and there are images of them. It's not something exclusive to the Assyrian Empire. So I think his point is not doesn't make his case.
Okay, can you comment just briefly famous argument absence of evidence? Because I read John Collins and he says, well, we don't find any inscription in Egypt about Jews, about Moses, Aaron, and maybe Joseph and similar. So what do you think about that?
I think that I hold to the same view as David Hackett Fisher, which is absence of evidence is nothing. It's nothing at all. It's not an argument for something. It's not an argument against something. It's nothing at all. Ehrman makes the same argument that, we don't find any evidence of the Israelites in Egypt. And he goes on and he says, well, it's a big nothing. Or he says it's a big absence. Well, a big absence is a big nothing. It's still nothing. Nothing times nothing is still nothing. A big absence is still an absence. It's still nothing. It's nothing for, it's nothing against. This is why we need positive evidence to make a case. So then, we look at, say, okay, yeah, we don't see Aaron or Moses in Egyptian documents, but we don't have much in the way of Egyptian court documents of that period. We've got nothing for those documents. We have very, very few court documents of Egypt. Okay, now, this astounds people, but because they're used to thinking that we've got a complete record of Egypt. We don't. We don't. We have a skeleton. We have the overview of Egyptian history written by Egyptian historians. Okay? And that's basically focused on the kings. Anybody else isn't really talked about because nobody else mattered. So when we look at, say, the royal annals and basically the day rules, these daily events in Egypt were kept in something called a day rule normally, where a proceeding went into the court and it would be just, they would put, what the date is and what happened that day in the court. Okay. We have one set of fragments of a day rule that dates to the reign of Ramses III. We have court documents in the Amarna letters of foreign governments sending their letters to Akhenaten, Tutankhamen, Smenkhare, but we don't have the responses from the Egyptians or what they thought about it. We have no other internal court documents for any other ruler of Egypt. None. The court documents for, say, Ramses II would have been held at P. Ramses, which is the modern site of Kantir. Kantir is wet. All that papyrus would have rotted away. Long, long time ago. So it's kind of like, okay, we have no documents. So is it surprising that Moses and Aaron don't appear in documents that no longer exist? Uh, yeah, I'm buying it.
Okay, me too.
The fact is that people do have um they mistaken what the Egyptians put on the walls with recorded history. Egyptians rarely put their history up on the walls. Those are religious documents. Those serve different purposes. So even in cases where their history is recorded on the walls, like their military victories, it's all done by using a religious slant. So they put their victories up on temple walls because it's an offering made to the gods. They don't put their defeats up on the walls. If they get a black eye to a bunch of slaves, they're not going to put that up on the walls. That's why when they do the poetic sections of their stele, they don't include internal strifes. It's all external. People they conquered on the outside, because those are good victories. Internal strifes are bad management. You don't want to include that on your religious documents, because some smart aleck god is going to say, "Wait, didn't you cause that rebellion?" No, it's kind of like the unblemished lamb. In Israelite ritual practice, you give the unblemished lamb to your god. Well, Egyptians give good victories to their gods and good offerings, not defeats. This is why throughout the entire history of Egypt, not a single defeat is recorded.
Great answer. Okay. What about mythicists when they compare Joseph with Greek and Persian myths? I didn't even watch that. Sorry, it's a long videos. So can you briefly comment that?
I think mythicists resort to woolly thinking. It's woolly thinking. Uh the the comparisons are so vague that you could compare anything to anything. Oh, mother and child, Jesus, Mary and Jesus. What were you expecting to come from a mother? An automobile? A laptop computer? You got a mother, it's going to produce a child. What were you think was going to come from it? It's like, 2 seconds of thought would have basically said, oh, maybe that comparison's a bit too vague. But no, oh no, we're not gonna stop and think. We're gonna charge right on ahead and make a comparison. Scholars have a word for this: parallelomania. And parallelomania is when you take parallels regardless of the counterfactuals. Logicians call this the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Okay, where the images of a Texas sharpshooter shooting against a barn, and he then just draws the target around where he hit. Okay. It's the idea that you're cherry picking the data, but excluding all the counterfactuals. So you're excluding all the contrary evidence. So the whole idea of Joseph being compared to, say, Persian myth or later Hellenistic myth is to basically draw that circle around your mark instead of actually seriously engaging the contrary evidence. And that's always been the problem with mythicism. Is it's just a a repetition, a consistent repetition of the Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
Great, I agree. Okay, what about Bitak's opinion when he compares that Joseph is similar with Irsu, I believe. He thinks that that's borrowed from that story. So, do you know about that? I don't really.
Well, I don't know much of Bitok's opinion here on that,
Yeah,
but
he's
there
open,
is,
so yeah.
yeah, he's um well, I mean, he's not a Christian. He does some of his Bible work is a bit loose. I wouldn't use him as a great source for any. I mean, he's an excellent Egyptologist. He did great work at Avaris at that excavation, but some of his biblical interpretation can be off sometimes.
Yeah, he admits that he is not an Old Testament scholar, so
He's
he's
not he's not an expert in this field.
yeah.
Um, but he does have his opinions on it, and his opinions have changed over time.
Yeah.
Sometimes they gotten better, sometimes they gotten worse. Just depends.
Okay. Hang on. What about Sobek, Douglas Petrovich theory that this is Joseph?
Oh boy. Hey, do you expect me to seriously comment on this?
That's great theory. Why? Why not?
Well, I mean, first of all, his idea that it's a Vizier Sobek Neferu. You can actually look up this guy. There is there's actually a work done called, I think, the Middle Kingdom Administrators of Egypt, and it talks about the biographies of people such as Sobek Neferu. And we do know that Sobek Neferu was an idolater. He had set up statues of himself to be worshipped. Uh, he's also very early. He's 12th dynasty. So this is going to be problematic for the biblical text in that Sobek Neferu was vizier long before the introduction of the chariot in Egypt. So it well predates this. The other thing too is Petrovich is basing it on a bad reading of Exodus 12, where it talks about he's depends upon the primacy of the Masoretic text to basically say that the sons of Israel were in Egypt 430 years. Whereas, say, other texts, such as the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch, say that, and even Galatians says that the Israelites were in Egypt and Canaan 430 years. The Masoretic text in that particular, in that version of Exodus 12, omits Canaan when it's really, really clear that that's part of the original text.
We have a new pharaoh arising after Joseph's death, and does that fit in a story that that's new dynasty or something?
Oh, sure, it does. The fact is that after the Hyksos, you have the arising of the 18th dynasty. So the 18th dynasty is an extension of the 17th dynasty, which is the Theban dynasty. So you have a cultural difference, a complete break. Now, one of the things about, say, Egyptian politics is that the the decisions of the past are continued to be respected going forward. So if a vizier of the 16th dynasty, stamped a document, that document would still be good in dynasty 17 because it's an extension of the same dynasty. And likewise, it would be respected into Dynasty 18 because that's all one continuous Theban dynasty. Okay. But the Hyksos weren't part of the Theban, say, legacy. So when the text talks about a new king rising up over Egypt who did not know Joseph, that sort of infers that it's a different line of textual and dynastic succession. So then when Akhmosa and the 18th dynasty take control of Egypt and drive out the Hyksos, the 15th dynasty, they're not going to respect any of those documents from Dynasty 15. So in that respect, it's like Joseph never existed. He's scrubbed from the record. You don't respect a vizier of a king that's not in the succession line of succession.
Okay, great answers, Dr. Falk. Thank you for your time, and I really
Sure.
enjoyed. And please, dear listeners, follow Ancient Egypt and the Bible, Dr. David Falk on YouTube. So thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you for having me.